Welcome to Outer Space, International Arts and Class Struggle Podcast.
On this week's show, Struggle for Art in Israel, an interview with Naor Kapulnik. Hi, my name's Rob McDonald, and I'm the host and presenter of Outer Space International Arts and Class Struggle podcast. And today we have a guest called Naor Kapulnik from Israel, Palestine. Hi, Naor, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Great stuff. Did I pronounce your name? Did I pronounce your name more or less okay?
Obviously not, but it's okay. It's Naor Kapulnik.
I'm really sorry. Okay, so now how I know you, I know you through your art that I've seen. I've known it particularly through some political art you've produced, but I know some of the other stuff you've done as well as a painter and a graphics maker. We worked a little bit together on various things, on a bad art project you've done stuff for. And also you did an image for the Solidarity Park festival, Brigadistas Return, that I did a number of years ago. So I know you as this artist. Got you on the show today because we want to talk a little bit about what's going on in arts and politics in Israel. So first of all, though, that's who I think you are, but I mean, what else is there to you? Who else are you? Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, I live in Tel Aviv. I'm an activist in socialist struggle movement here, and which is part of the International Socialist Alternative organization. I worked in finance for a lot of years, and I also helped to build a union there and was a member of the union committee for a few years. And I also obviously do art. Yeah.
Okay, cool. So I mean, that's your political, your work, and your artistic background. So I think you know, for our listeners, I think it might be worth, you know, can you tell us something about sort of the recent political history in Israel, Palestine, in society, and how that interacts with art questions? You know, give us a bit of a sort of a mini history, if you can, about, you know, how things are there.
Well, that's some challenge to give a political history.
Yeah. Well, that's how I do it on this podcast. I give you a ridiculously large question, and then we go wherever we go. So, I mean, yeah, I think what I'm kind of saying is, can you give some sort of backdrop? Because I don't think many people would know, you know, outside of Israel, particularly, the art scene there, what's going on, what's taken place, you know, in recent history. So it's just a bit of a background really to some of the movements, some of the activist stuff that might have taken place, you know, anything you think might be of interest, really.
Well, first of all, I'll start from these days. We don't have art because of COVID, everything is obviously closed. We are still under a third lockdown at the moment. So, yeah, that's about it. Now, historically, obviously, you can't separate any kind of discussion about the history of Israel without acknowledging the importance of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And historically, the Israeli regime, the Israeli government, always try to and maintain racial discrimination towards Palestinian, and it also manifested in discrimination when it comes to art, and it comes to culture, and it comes to budgets, and how much does Palestinian artists get in comparison to Jewish artists. And to put it all in context, in general, the Israeli government does not invest too much in culture. It's the biggest
in general, it's very...
Yeah, the biggest part of the budget is security, is the military.
Yeah, it's a very militarized. It's a very militarized society. Yeah.
So, but actually, it became a little bit worse in the last few years, and that this is the premise I want to start with. Just before the COVID, I think 2 years before the COVID, you had the minister of culture, and I think it's called culture, that initiate a law that the name of the law was loyalty in art, loyalty in culture, or something like that, which means
loyalty in culture. Okay, so this sounds quite sort of Stalinistic, totalitarian stuff.
Something like that, which means if you don't, if you criticize the army or you criticize the government or the country, you will not get a budget. And obviously, it's targeting Palestinian artists, but also Jewish artists who are against the occupation or criticizing the role of this government. Now, it's important to say that eventually this law didn't pass because there was a resistance against it. There was demonstration against it. And if you look, I can name like 100 times in the last few years that the government tried to shut up artists, to silence artists and so on. But more importantly, I think, is that every time it happened, you had some form of resistance. Is it enough? Well, it's enough to topple this law, and that law didn't pass eventually. But we need much more, and we need to change. It's obviously why we need to change the government itself, and this is why I'm a political activist. But and I give you another example again just before COVID, and then we dive into COVID itself. There is a book that I'm now trying to understand how I'm going to translate. It's something like Live Fence of
say again, sorry, I didn't hear you.
Live Fence, I don't know.
Okay, Live Fence. Okay.
Cool. Of a writer called Dorit Rubinia. It's about a love story between a Jewish woman and a Palestinian man. And
maybe Love on the Fence. Love on the Fence. If it's a love story, maybe I'm rewriting the title. Anyway, okay. So you're talking about a book. Okay, yeah, cool.
A book that was part of the curriculum. It was in schools. And then
so in England we would study Shakespeare, so it was something it was like a kind of not Macbeth, Romeo and Juliet maybe, or something like that the kids would study, that kind of story.
Something like Romeo and Juliet, if you want. Even though it's a modern piece and not something from 300 years ago.
There's some really good modern productions of Romeo and Juliet, mind you. Yeah. So anyway, let's not go off on Shakespeare today. So go on, carry on about this book. Then it was on the curriculum. What happened?
And then the Ministry of Education decided to take it out of the curriculum because this is tough time, and the ideas that the book represent are problematic, something like that. And they did. They took it out of the curriculum of school students. So I think what is important is to talk about the reaction to this act, and the fact that this book rose again to the top selling list of books for a few weeks and had to be republished because people
wanted it.
Wanted to buy it people wanted it as a sort of, I think...
so it sort of backfired on them then. So basically there was this love story between an Israeli and a Palestinian. It used to be on the curriculum. And then, because of a more totalitarian government attitude that has been developing. They went to remove it thinking they were all powerful, no doubt, and then the response was, people started buying it and people wanted to know the story more. Okay, so and were there protests around that as well? I mean, you talked a bit before about protests and things,
but you have more than that. You have like Palestinian artists are daily targeted. And just to give you an example of a protest, again, just before the COVID, a Palestinian hip hop group called Dam, very famous, I think, also in the world, and they had a show in Haifa, in the city of Haifa in Israel, and it was already booked. It was a show as part of a festival by the city council, and the fact that this is my cat, by the way, if you hear it, and
we allow cats on the show,
and then this minister of then this minister of
cat's got something to say, has he?
Yeah, I guess so. So the government tried to ban this show because they are more left-wing, they are against the occupation, stuff like this. And again, the outcome was thousands of people in the show eventually who came to see, like it was packed. It was much more than they anticipated.
Yeah, so I mean, it shows one of the elements of the power of the arts, and also how people can respond to things that if you're told you're not allowed to, you want it, and if it's a creative piece, then people will go out and consume it in some manner anyway, fascinating. I mean, is there other examples of the struggle in around the question of the arts that you'd like to give?
Yeah, I think my last example will be something recently from just a few weeks ago, a movie called Jenin by the director named Mohammed Bakri. It's actually a movie that was produced almost 20 years ago, right after a bloody escalation, a bloody invasion of the Israeli army to a refugee camp called Jenin in the West Bank. And this Palestinian artist, what he did, who lives in Israel, he came to Jenin and interviewed resident over there, Palestinian resident, who talked about this really bloody attack, horrible days. And he was actually attacked by the Israeli establishment for years after this. He lost his job. He's also an actor, and no job for him for almost 20 years. And eventually, just a few weeks ago, as I said, just recently, the court decided to ban the movie. Not just ban him. Now it's illegal to show him, like in a cinema or something like this. But they also took all the hard copies of the movie. They actually took it, and also he had to pay more. I think something like 50,000 euros as a fine. This is this is a very serious attack on a movie. It's just a movie. But I also think it's important to say that the Union of Movie Director, they have like an organization of their own. They went out against this attack in solidarity with him, saying that this is a wrong decision by the court.
I mean, I think it shows, doesn't it, that the fear of a regime like you have in Israel towards artists, that they have to try and keep the lid on them, that they have to do things like this. They have to try and ruin somebody, basically, who's an actor and a filmmaker, like this story that you talk about, and the others. So I think, for me, I think what it shows also is the importance of arts and culture in the struggle, especially under repressionist, I don't know if that's a word, is it? under repression, that actually art and culture can tell stories maybe that in other times you're not able to get out so clearly. Would that be the case in Israel? Are artists, if somebody's an artist, are they quite radicalized? Would that be something that's true, or is not the case? What would you think?
Yeah, I think most of the artists are more left.
Yeah,
the position of the government and more critical. Yeah.
Well, I was going to ask you a question because, as you know, I'm a sculptor and I make, I make monuments, and I'm very interested in. I've done a couple of interviews with people who do similar stuff, and I was aware of a story about a statue that was put up because of the Black Lives Matter movement that happened last year. There was a lot of radical art. There was a lot of pulling down of right-wing statues, and there was a lot of putting up of alternative statues. And came across a story about a statue of a protester was put up because there's protests against Netanyahu. Another difficult pronunciation. I shouldn't be doing a podcast quite clearly, by the way. I can't pronounce things properly. But anyway, there we go. So there's been a lot of protests against Netanyahu, who's a historical leader of the right in Israel. And I know there's been a lot of protests. And I know there was a statue put up in honor of a protest against him, and then that caused a bit of a storm, and a bit of controversy. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, the artist's name is Isreali, and he did actually a series of statues in public venues, like in the main square in Tel Aviv, and also in the main square in Jerusalem, where the biggest demonstrations against Netanyahu are being held. One of the statues was a statue of Netanyahu in gold, not real gold, but like a golden statue of Netanyahu in the middle of the square.
Okay.
Another statue was of one of like a symbolic statue of a protester, or someone who protested against Netanyahu, with a flag and everything. And he actually did a little bit a few statues like that, and all these statues were erected at the same time that you had these protest movements against Netanyahu that is still happening.
So this is interesting to me because on a number of different ways. Maybe we'll explore it a little bit because we interviewed Leo Carson, who did a statue around Black Lives Matter in Oakland, and other things that we've connected with. And first of all, the question is, did he put these statues without permission? I mean, because there's, what I call sort of monument graffiti, not spraying on graffiti like often happens, but actually putting in a positive sense an alternative statues and monuments in the squares. Because for me, this is really important because it's about talking about who owns the square, who has the right to put the message, because art, as we know, is very symbolic. People read things into it. We could discuss that another time, but in general, that's true. We walk down the street and we see a statue, at least in London and places like that, to kings and queens and great leaders of the past. And it's all about a symbolic message about who's in control, And now, since Black Lives Matter, but actually before in America as well, there's been a movement for the last 5 years, I think, of challenging this symbolic nature of monuments and statues and arts. So, I'm first of all interested, did he put it illegally? And and then, maybe tie it into a little bit about the movement itself, because I think one of the important things is when you do an act like this, and I've considered these things before, and I know other artists that do. It's sometimes a bit of an adventure to go and put something and make a symbolic statement. It gets taken down and then you think you're finished, but actually tying this kind of method into the struggle itself, what role do you think that plays? Anyway, there's about 3 questions in there, but have a crack.
Well, first of all, I think I have to add something else, which is to understand how usually how do you see a square, like a public square or a street in Israel? Because most of Israel was developed in the 50s and the 60s, you don't have this culture of statues like when I was in London or stuff like this, when you see like these old people that was like a statue that was built like in the 19th century and I think it's it exists in the US and in Europe in generally. And usually if you see a statue in like a main square or a street or a boulevard in Israel, it will be actually of like an abstract structure and not like
of an individual
shape.
thing. Yeah, it's an interesting take on it. Yeah.
So Itai, when he did his statues, all of them were illegal. All of them were taken down by the city council workers the day after that, or a few hours after he put it up. But the media talked about it, and it was
which is the purpose of doing it, is like getting it up, getting the photo, and getting the fuck out of there. Is kind of the tactic to stimulate, stimulate the discussion on the symbolism of it. That's so. And how did the? I mean, tell us a little bit about the movement as well, because I think that's important. And how did it interconnect with this sort of art action?
Well, I think, first of all, we can talk a lot about the movement against Netanyahu itself. Now it's a little bit of a shaky movement, and it's going a little bit down at the moment. But we can talk about the weaknesses, the fact that they are talking, the main slogans are only about the corruption that Netanyahu is doing, and not about everything. But at the same time, in this protest movement, you have a room for people who are against the occupation, people who are political, people, and all kinds of groups and ideas. They are not the main scene, but they are there, which is important. We can go a lot about it, but I think in regard to art, I think there was in this movement, it is called the Balfour movement, because this is the name of the street where Netanyahu house is in Jerusalem. And this is where the demonstration started to explode. And you had an explosion of artistic energy, I think. And part of it is, or I think mainly, or part of it is because of COVID. The fact that you have a whole young generation who has nowhere to go, no pubs, no restaurants, no art scene,
no way to vent your energies in general and your frustrations also.
So this is where in Balfour demonstrations you could found this huge manifestation of artistic life with costumes, with all kind of extremely innovative signs. Like if you go to a printing place and do a protest sign, it's not good. You have to do it your own. You have to do it by yourself in your home. You take like a piece of place.
That's actually, I mean, that's actually something that's developed over recent years in demonstrations. Definitely. I mean, people have always made their own placards, but actually, there's been a bit. There has been. I mean, I've never really thought about maybe discussing it, but there has been an explosion of homemade placards. I mean, I was here in Spain when the Indignado movement, the Quinceañera movement exploded. And there was a big a party having a banner, so people would make their own, and I think this is on some senses that's negative, but on a lot of ways it's really positive that people actually concretely think consciously in their own home, maybe with their mates, what message do I want to say, and I think it represents a thinking process. Whether what they say is brilliant or funny or politically sharp is a secondary point to the fact that they've chosen to create something with their own message. So I think that's an interesting point. So sorry, go on telling us a little bit more about this. You were on a flow. I think I interrupted you.
No, No, so you saw a lot of energy, and young people are involved in making. They put lamps and electricity in the on the signs themselves. Something that looks very unique and special, and this is also one feature of the demonstration of the demonstration movement. But again,
yeah, I suppose one obvious question that comes to my mind, and maybe it's a complicated one, but how does the these movements, is there any way that they help develop unity between Israelis and Palestinians in fighting for things? I mean, maybe in the movement, maybe this is a question for the movement itself. Rather than necessarily the role of art in it, but I'm interested whether art plays a role of bridging some of the difficulties, whether it plays any role at all in that, or whether it doesn't. Do you understand what I mean? I mean, because obviously it's a very divided society. It's very, you mentioned the racial divide and the laws that are there and the occupied territories, so we're obviously not going into all the major questions today. We're touching on the art questions around the major questions, but it strikes me as whether does art play any role in bridging some of those things? Is there anything there? Is there any links between Palestinians and Israelis on the question of art and creativity? And do you understand where I'm coming from? Is there anything to be said, do you think?
There are, in a way. It's obviously at the moment, this is a major obstacle of the movement itself, because it's mainly a Jewish movement.
Yeah.
It's Palestinians do not. It's very rare to see a Palestinian protester in this protest, and this is one of the weaknesses of the movement itself. And I don't think that artists themselves can come with a formula that is simply only art to bridge the gap. It's a political issue. But having said that, the movement radicalized a whole layer of people. And for instance, now they have a group of activists from the protest movement formed a new party called the Democratic Party, which is as part of the declaration of the party. They are against the occupation, So you have examples, and also historically you have, for instance, in the last protest movement, the 2011.
That would have been around a similar time as I was talking about the Indignados against the ME kind of
the
development.
Indignados, and even more importantly, the Arab Spring.
Yeah, I was going to say,
happened at the same time. So when you have large protest movement, and it was larger than what we had now, you had examples of links between Palestinian protesters and demands against racism and against particular oppression toward Palestinian within the larger demonstrations. But so you had actually a lot of examples like that. It's still not the main course. It's still not, we still have a lot to work on.
Yeah, but I mean, it's important to draw out the positives of, these things, and, obviously overcome the major obstacles, that movements can have. I mean, maybe we should drag ourselves back up to date a little bit because, obviously we're still, as you mentioned at the top of the show, you said, well, there is no art at the moment because of COVID. Actually, I think there's a lot of art going on. It's just not on show at the moment, and theatres and all these things are shut. And we're going through a very sort of, this podcast I'm doing is part of me redirecting myself, and I think there's a lot of interesting stuff going on online and whatever. But I'm kind of interested about how the COVID crisis has affected the arts in where you are, and also whether there's been any because arts has been shut down, and because probably post COVID, there's going to be a decimation. It's like when the tide goes out, you're going to see lots of dead art things and artists who's lost their jobs. And, the art industry is under major attack in many countries. And I've spoken in the podcast to different people, and there's all of them have indicated some organization of artists going on, in different spheres. Is that something that's found itself happening in Israel?
Well, yeah. Actually, for instance, one example is a new union that started.
Okay.
Actually, they started to form the union just a few months before COVID started, but with just the first few steps. But when COVID started, it formed and they started the struggle itself. And this is a union of workers in the cultural centers, mainly in Tel Aviv. Which is like if you have like a community center, if you have all kinds.
Well, galleries and museums as well, that kind of worker, or more cultural centers.
More culture or community centers.
Okay, important places because art would get produced in those places in general. I mean, it might be where a local exhibition would take place rather than big art. Would that be correct?
Yeah. Some of them, definitely, and also where you have cultural and artistic education that is being provided to people, to young children or to adults. It's a lot of teachers and workers in a cultural center in the city, and they unionize mainly on the background of the fact that they have the worst working conditions. They are not even considered to be workers, and in many occasions.
I mean, often,
obviously,
Sorry, I was just saying it's quite often the case that artists and community workers, art workers like in museums and these places, and also community workers are often artists themselves at the same time as working in these industries. But it's just a side point. But sorry, continue.
Yeah, yes, definitely. But everything escalated when COVID started because they closed all the community centers, and when they tried to reopen it during the crisis, the management tried to impose worse conditions on workers. So this was the spark of the struggle. They had the demonstration. They now had an achievement where the management finally decided to acknowledge them and start a proper negotiation with the union.
Okay, so it's very good. So I mean, out of the situation, they've got themselves organised. They've won, maybe a couple of little battles. How do you see this movement unfolding into the future? Because is there a potential to reach out to individual artists? Because one of the problems we have, and we talk about it quite a lot on the show, is sometimes the individual nature of artists and outlook. And one of the important things, a bit like what we were saying about Israel, Palestine in general, is to overcome, is to build unity. And so we're talking here about cultural workers in the main. But do you think how do you think the movement could evolve to bring artists in general, the individual artists, the different examples you've given? Is there a way, do you think, that could be brought into a united movement?
Well, for one, if I look at other organizations, like there is an organization of painters, there's an organization of stage artists who actually went on to do a few demonstrations in the last year. And so, and I look at them, and in a way, all of them became a combative organization. All of them,
interesting. Because I spoke, sorry to interrupt you, because I'd like to pull this out of you a little bit more, because there's been, when I talk to some people on this question, there's this talk about the difference between art unions that are craft unions, which you join to sort of get yourself better into the career, and it has benefits, and it's an association. And then there's the model of the trade union, which is industrial, which is about being competitive and fighting for rights. So you're talking a little bit about. Could you explain it a little bit more about that process that's going on?
Yes, definitely. We are talking about crafts union, which are usually, as you said, are not competitive. They are just, organizing shows and stuff like this. So, helping give all information to artists. And now, during the last year, they have become a competitive organization fighting against and demanding from the government more support and so on. And I think, and that's the landscape now. If you look at these organizations, so this is just an example to show how attitude has changed. And I think it's here to stay. I think because the crisis is going to be long. It's not going to be finished in months or two. And this is an example of what approach we need to have towards the government in order to demand more benefits and so on. So this is one point, and the other point is also at the same time that we saw the COVID crisis in Israel it was major layoffs. We're talking about 1 million workers, which is close to 1/4 of the workforce being thrown into unemployment lines and unemployment benefit and so on, which is actually slashing the salaries in at least 30 or 40%, but it's actually more if you are young workers or an artist, for instance. And but at the same time, we saw that the unions they didn't do enough. They didn't do enough to struggle at all. I have especially the main workers' union, the Histadrut, but at the same time, they did have money on their own, and they did hire the singers and to have like a Zoom shows.
So there was a kind of, I mean, this is really interesting point because again, we talk on the show a little bit about the connection between the workers' movement and, let's say, the artist movement. Now, they're not two necessarily separate things all the time, but we look at it a little bit like that. And I'm always of the opinion that the artists, we need to look towards the workers' movement because it represents unity, class unity, organization often. At the same time as the workers' movement often needs to look towards the artist movement because they're creative, they think out the box, they're not necessarily in stuffy, boring meetings. These are quite sort of simplistic ways of putting it. But the fusing of those two elements is quite important in the renewing of the trade union movement in general, I think. And also, I think there's an important role, like if you like, the artist wing of the workers' struggle internationally as well as in every single country. And it seems to me that you're talking here about maybe some early steps that's taking place, that maybe hasn't existed for quite some time in many places, not just in Israel.
Mm-hmm. Well, the biggest union federation here in Israel has actually a sad history of not leading struggles, but completely controlled by a right-wing bureaucracy and so on. But at the same time, they had some good experience with organizing cultural events for workers and support for artists who are part of the union and so on. And in a capitalist world, and especially in a capitalist world that capitalism itself is not functioning during this crisis, this can be like a lifeline to artists, where you have workers themselves have their own money that they collected, if you want. and
Yeah,
they
I think
can
it's.
be
I think
used to.
it's definitely come out in a couple of other interviews I've done that it's one thing for the unions, especially cultural unions, to call for a percentage of the budget of the national budget to go towards art and crafts. But I know of some cases where the unions themselves have looked at their own budget, and said, okay, if we're calling for say 3% of the budget of the nation to go towards art and culture, we should do the same, and in doing that, it is one way of bringing this creative energy of the arts movement into the workers' movement. So I think, yeah, it sounds like a positive thing, and it builds trust and unity within the struggle in general. Well, listen. I think we've. I see this as a bit of a platform discussion with you, where we could maybe, as things develop in Israel and Palestine, maybe we'll come back to you, and as movements happen, and if there's significant further organisation, particularly in the arts and cultural sector, maybe we'll get you back for a bit of an update and that kind of thing. Would you be okay with that?
Yeah, I would love to.
Cool. Okay. Well, look, let's keep in contact. Thank you very much for coming on the show and giving us if you like, a basic understanding of what's taking place at the moment. And we look forward to seeing you in the future. Okay.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of our podcast. This week we don't have a space station or music for you because we are working a lot on our Solidarity Park Festival. If you want to find out more about the festival, head over to solidaritypark.com. And if you want to support the podcast, you can donate to us through our website.
We hope you enjoyed the show. If you have something to say to us, then join our Facebook group or contact us at outaspace.com. That's outa-space.com. See you soon.